Hey friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
Hey, Rewind friends, welcome back to the podcast here. And for the first time in our lockdown edition of Zoom podcast, we have three of us here. So Derek Fuller's been our mainstay here, rocking with us every week, and then joined by the co-lead pastor, Kirk Giles. So we got the big guns in the Zoom room today. So I'm going to throw to you, Kirk, first. Give us the most exciting thing that's happened in your last 24 hours.
Oh, man. I don't even remember what happened in my last 24 hours, man. It has just been, the days are all blurring together and I cannot keep track of anything anymore. So
I'll give you a week. Okay. Most exciting thing in the last week.
Most exciting thing in the last week, besides church on Sunday, which is the right answer to give, watching the Blue Jays play in front of real live fans gave me some sense of hope that it's possible in my lifetime I will see a Blue Jays game in person again.
Was that the Houston game? Because they were pretty packed there.
Yeah, they were packed, and there were not a lot of face masks in the crowd, which, again, I just take it as hope.
I didn't know if that would elicit hope or jealousy in you.
Both. So, it did elicit jealousy, but I'm going to go with the hope thing to sound more spiritual for the podcast.
All right. Nice. Right. Great. A little peek behind the curtain of your co-lead pastors here, team. So Derek, same question to you. Last week, I'll give you the same courtesy I ended up giving Kirk here. Most exciting thing in your last week?
We got a new set of wheels. So we traded in the van and got some new wheels. So that was
nice.
That was
What'd
fun.
you get? Are we allowed to know? Was it a private jet? You got a private jet.
I did not. Sometimes it feels like I'm riding in a private jet when I get in it. It's the Kia Telluride.
Ooh, that is a fancy little ride.
Yeah.
Awesome. So again,
I got to get rid of the van. Got to get rid of the minivan. So that was a moment of celebration.
I did the exact same thing.
That's a milestone. Yeah. That's a milestone in any family when you can finally get rid of a minivan.
Yeah. We did the same thing.
Yeah.
We got rid of our
that's
van buddy.
That's primarily going to be Amanda's vehicle still. So, but I'm driving it right now because she's teaching from home.
That's right. So you upgraded from the Accent to the Telluride?
Yeah, but I'll be back in the Accent soon.
All good things must end, friend. All good things must end. All right. So we are talking this week, continuing on in our series, The New Normal. And I just want to say to you guys as the communicators, man, like this has been such a joy for me to walk through. Somebody who's just primarily receiving this. I've super appreciated the perspective and the chance to marinate in a passage. I know we've encouraged our people, and I've taken that to heart, to just keep looping through Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And it's been cool to sort of like continue to mine the depths of, just 3 chapters, but man, there's a ton in there. So because there's a ton, you guys attacked the same passage a little bit differently. We'll start with you, Derek. You were in teaching to our Kitchener location. Would you give us sort of a 2-sentence summary of where you were headed on Sunday?
Yeah, so I was looking at the fact that since Jesus is the truth, his people should be people who reflect that. And so we should be people who keep our commitments and people who can be taken at face value when we say something and give our word on something.
Man, that's so needed these days. Kirk, you landed in a real similar spot. Is there anything you would say to differentiate you were teaching to our Kitchener or to our Cambridge folks, where you landed precisely?
Yeah, I think that's probably where I concluded was we do this because this is who God is and this is what it means to faithfully follow Jesus. And I think just to actually be able to say that, like, this is normal life in God's kingdom.
Yeah.
Fully always living up to your word is just, that's normal. Which is completely abnormal. You talk about mining the depths of these passages, Andrew, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that Jesus did all of this in one sermon.
Yeah, Derek and I hit that a little bit last week. Being like, this is probably sort of like the notes that would go up on the projection screen behind Jesus while he was preaching. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not even into the center of the sermon yet. Like, we're still in the opening third.
Yeah. If you can make it past the first 2 or 3 lines and feel like you're killing it, man, like this, you'd just be living a premium life. Now, so we're talking about this integrity. I think both of you guys pulled this out in your sermon, sort of helping us understand this passage that could feel a little bit weird. And the, like, don't swear by heaven or by Jerusalem and all those sorts of things that could feel a little bit, if you don't understand sort of the context and all that sort of stuff. I didn't know that it was like the searching for the loopholes. Like if I swear by this, then I'm not really swearing and like aligning myself with God in this. And then we got to the conversation on loophole kids. And after like almost 17 years in student ministry, oh man, could I relate to these conversations. So I thought, I can't remember which one of you guys said this, but like we all can sort of see that, but then we also are that more than we care to admit. Derek, you had a wonderful example of a youth ministry experience in that.
Yeah.
Just any other gold for us there? Because you spend a decent amount of time in student ministry, and I know that was a breeding ground for those sorts of conversations.
Yeah, it just prepped me for adult ministry. Nothing changes. I mean, we just get better at rationalizing stuff. Mm-hmm. We're not as obvious about things. At least when you're dealing with students, it's just really obvious.
Yeah,
really, really obvious. They haven't developed the ability to smooth off the rough edges there of it, and pretend as well as we do. But I think I run into this quite frequently. I talked a little bit about this in the area of people who are coming to me with marriage issues, but just in marriages in general. I don't know how many times I've had guys who come in and want to point to Ephesians chapter 5. And they want me to talk to their wife about what does Ephesians chapter 5 say about what a godly woman would be as a wife. And they want to totally ignore the fact that the bulk of the passage is written to men. And my response is always the same. Like, how about you come back to me after you've really got Ephesians 5 done in the part that speaks to you, and then we can talk to your wife. Mm-hmm. And we just never want to focus on the part that's written to us, right?
Yeah, we've talked a number of times just about that, like, ability to be self-deceived. Even if I don't even know if it's necessarily even justification all the time. It's just like we deceive ourselves. When you were talking through student ministry stuff, I remembered one time being on a camping trip with some kids, and we were playing cards, which, in a Baptist church might get me in trouble, but I was at a Christian Reformed church at the time, so it was fine. And we were playing the game Cheat, and these two kids were sitting beside each other, exchanging cards under the table. And I was like, guys, you can't do that. And they both looked at me and said, the game is called Cheat. We can do whatever we want. I was like, you're not wrong. But I
why
feel
Baptists don't like cards, Andrew. That's why Baptists don't like cards. Don't encourage that type of behavior.
Well, I stopped right then and there. That was my come to Jesus moment when it came to card games. But I think we far too often think that with that mentality, like, I've got to sort of like cut the corners and, take whatever advantage I can find for myself, even if that means I'm outright, lying or being dishonest, or if I'm like operating in a gray area. For sure, we feel a little more comfortable because we have to sort of assert ourselves in that. Now, I know, Kirk, you made a confession that triggered me deeply. I hate video games, and a lot of that comes down to playing with my younger brother, who would do exactly what you did. I was going to win, and he would just go, oh, or like when it was Nintendo, you just stomp real hard on the floor and it just resets the game. We had to put it on a pillow so that he couldn't do that. Oh.
Oh yeah, I was talking to my son and my daughter after the service, and they were watching the sermon, and they said, "Dad, as soon as you started this story, I knew exactly where you were going with it, and I was getting angry at you just as you were telling the story because I know exactly how this finishes."
Like, Kirk, you seem like such a gentle person. I can't imagine you getting heated to that level, but there's a sick and twisted, broken part of me that wants to push you towards that end just to see what happens.
There's a competitive side of me that you haven't seen yet, Andrew. It's, it may or may not come out if you like cross-check my son into a wall again or something like that.
Again, that's right. That would be the second time that happened. We're all getting exposed here on the podcast. So that was a great week, everybody. Hope you'll tune in next time. I'm just kidding. So you guys pointed out, like, in our culture, we sort of have this like suspicion that everybody is doing that, right? That everybody has sort of got an agenda and they're not really giving us the full goods and living like completely honestly. That the necessity to swear on things and like justify and like substantiate your claims feels really like needed right now. I can't remember. I think it was you, Kirk, who talked about, politicians and, even sometimes spiritual leaders. We always sort of like, yeah, but why are you saying what you're saying? What's really beneath that? And it's really easy to see it. Derek, I think you came after lawyers again, because you did that last week on the podcast as well.
Listen, so to be fair, like we think of the scribes and Pharisees primarily as religious leaders, right? But functionally, they spent their time working through, arguing, talking about the law, and they became adept at knowing exactly how far you could push things in order to stay within the letter of the law. And this is a lot of why Jesus is speaking into this, right? Is because they have developed systems, and it has created a culture in which what's most important is that we follow the letter of the law, irregardless of what the intent or spirit of the law is.
Yeah.
And I think that happens. Like, I just think legal systems push you towards that, right? And it's not a dig on lawyers. If you're a defense lawyer, man, I want somebody who's going to know the law as well as they can and figure out the best argument to get me off.
Yeah. And fun fact, that was my career choice before the Lord called me into ministry. So be prepared for me to dig in on that if you're giving me the opportunity to do that. But I think we can see it out there, right? We can see it. We're like, I don't trust those politicians, or those lawyers are a little bit smarmy, and I don't want to, trust what they're saying because they have always got an agenda. But I think, Kirk, you diagnosed it as the yeah buts, right? Like that we don't see that in ourselves. So why do we have that blind spot where we can see it real clearly out there, but as soon as we're the ones on trial, we don't see it? Kirk, I'll throw that to you.
I think that we have this unique ability to justify our actions because at the end of the day, we always want to seek our own self-interests. At the root of it all, there is kind of this sense of whether it's protecting myself, whether it's finding the best possible outcome for myself. The yeah buts come about trying to pursue self-interest. And so it's normalized. It has become normalized for us. Most of the time, I don't even think we think about it anymore. It's the way we live in our culture. It's the way we've grown up in our homes and even existed in our churches over the years. We've found ways to normalize the yeah buts and the easy excuses to kind of get out of whatever it is we're trying to get out of and find the loopholes.
So Derek, if we're talking about truth this week and living like with full unabashed honesty, how do we as the people of Jesus begin to actually do that when the default setting in us and in the world is to cut corners and blur lines and make it gray?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. I think first of all, we have to have a theology, and I know Kirk closed with this, and I talked about it in my message as well. A theology that understands that God is a God of his word, that he keeps his promises. He's a promise-keeping God, right? That he is a God who when he speaks his word, it is reality. So just think to the very nature of creation. How does creation come into being? God speaks.
Yeah.
Because God brings into reality with his words, right? Our words then therefore should always reflect reality. That's what truth is. Truth is an accurate reflection of reality. And so if we're going to reflect the God that we worship, and if particularly the second person of the Trinity, Jesus is known as the truth. He confesses that he is the truth. The Holy Spirit is a spirit of truth who leads us into all truth. Like it is foundational to the nature of the Trinity, right? In all aspects. So we have to have that theological grounding first to say, like, truth is not optional because of who the God is that I follow, worship, serve. Then that gets us to really consider our words. I think we're flippant with our words. I think when you read really thoughtful followers of Jesus throughout history, they're very measured in their words. We live in a culture that's not measured in our words because we live in a soundbite culture, right? So in a soundbite culture, you have to get yourself heard as quickly as possible. We don't have time to have measured discussions about things or carefully consider and people don't have the patience to even listen to measured responses and arguments, right? But we have to get back to believing that words matter. They're not just a cheap currency. They're an expensive currency that we have to take seriously.
Yeah. Now, Kirk, you ended up hitting on the fact that truth in our culture is pretty relative, that we don't have it moored to much. How do you think that affects our ability to live in full levels of honesty?
Well, it will always be shifting if it's relative, right? Because it will always be switching to the circumstance or the moment or anything like that. And I think that, and it will still always continue to be self-centered at the end of the day. It will continue to feed our own safety, security, sense of comfort, whatever we're looking for. That's where you get language like, this is my truth, right? And so now everybody has their truth. And it's impossible for everybody to have their truth and for all of it to be true. Like it doesn't work. And at some point in time, it comes into conflict with each other along the way. I was just reflecting on that last night with a guy. We were talking about things in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I said, even in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, there reaches a point where things within the Charter are actually in conflict with each other. People's freedoms bump up against each other, and somebody somewhere has to decide whose freedoms end up winning out. And that just becomes part of even trying to discern truth. And that's where you get into my truth, your truth, and we all work through those things. And, Jesus keeps calling us back to this way of truth, which I think one of the things that I talked about on Sunday was the idea that ultimately the way of truth is really the way of love, right? It's a love for God first. And second, it's a love for other people that actually says, I don't need to try to look out for my own best interest by, cutting corners and looking for the easy way out or the loopholes. But that I actually will follow through on things and live truthfully because I actually truly love other people. And that is something that we don't often connect those dots together between how my ability to live out the truth is connected to my actual living out of loving towards other people.
Because historically, in my truth, my experience, people who are deeply concerned about truth often do that in a way that feels somewhat destructive, right? Like they can be if you don't align with these theological statements or these, set of assertions or facts, that's when we think truth, we often think like our understanding in our mind. And what I loved, I think both of you guys pretty helpfully pushed us towards truth being, this term hit me when you guys were speaking, that I don't know that either of you actually said, but that truth is an embodied belief, that it's got to be something that we live out, not just understand, that it would manifest itself in love for neighbor, love for God. And that's, if you think through like our purpose, love God, love others, serve the world, like you see as we get rooted in that truth, that it embodies itself in action. And I think sometimes we forget that, right? Like that we've got the truth warriors out there, but they just want you to agree with them, not to actually change your life. Is that am I wrong in that, or is that a fair statement? Go to you, Derek.
I'm not even sure. Sometimes I'm not even sure if they care whether you agree with them. They just want you to acknowledge they're right. Right? Like
that is different.
We've already talked about the competitive nature of human beings. I think a lot of times people who are heavy on emphasizing or saying they would be people of truth really just like to win. And they like to win arguments. And they like to feel as if like you have to come to a point where you recognize you're wrong and I'm right. And of course, one of the things the gospel calls us to is to recognize we're all wrong and Jesus is right.
Right.
And that's different. And that's the difference between a righteousness found in Christ and a self-righteousness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so I think rooting our sense of truth, not in our circumstances, not in our own understanding, but in the person and the life of Jesus, that the full embodiment of truth, right? Like that's where we have to keep up. And that's this whole sermon. And I just keep being blown away at the brilliance of it, right? Like that Jesus is teaching us what he will ultimately demonstrate with his entire life. And
yeah.
So
I was captured by that because I've been thinking through, first of all, I keep on coming back to the Beatitudes, and then kind of like now we're seeing the Beatitudes in practice.
Yeah.
But then looking forward, having the full story of who Jesus is, we're going to come this next week to his teaching on retaliation and what it looks like, how you treat your enemy, right? And every time you just look and say, Jesus is not just, these aren't just ideas that Jesus is putting out there. They are reflections that he is the embodiment, right? Of all of this. He is the perfect example of the Sermon on the Mount lived out in totality in his life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just, again, keep being blown away by the beauty of the pairing of the Sermon on the Mount and the life of Jesus. I think it's compelling, man. Like, even if you're not a follower of Jesus, this stuff has to capture your attention.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that has jumped out at me, because if you've been around faith for any length of time, you've probably read the Sermon on the Mount a few times and or heard sermons on it. And sometimes you start to hear things, you become so familiar with them, and you almost start to take Jesus for granted. And I was talking to a guy last week, and he said to me, he said, Kirk, you got to remember that Jesus was always the smartest person in the room. Every conversation, he was always the smartest person in the room. He was always the wisest person in the room. He was always like, so if Jesus walked into the room today, if you were in any gathering of any kind and Jesus walked into the room, you would want to go and actually get as close as you could to that guy, just because you knew that there's nobody else in the room who knows nearly as much as that guy knows. And I thought that's a really helpful perspective for those of us who kind of have started to take Jesus for granted, because we've heard some stories so many times, to actually remember that Jesus is always the smartest guy in the room. And so going and sitting at his feet and just listening to him is the best thing that we could do for our souls.
And as we were chatting, like, if we're sort of landing on this fact that if Jesus is the embodiment of truth, Kirk, you had a pretty thoughtful reflection on, that living that out as his followers, isn't always received the way that we hope that it is. Do you want to sort of build that out for us?
Yeah. So here's what happens. So even God himself has moments where if you were Israel in the Old Testament, you wouldn't feel like God is living up to his covenant to you. Right? So God allows you to go into exile and you got to live for decades away from your homeland in slavery to another country. There's nothing in there that's sitting there going, yeah, I know God is with me. Yeah. Right? Emotionally, you're not feeling the closeness of God. You're not feeling that God's living up to his promises. You just, but when we kind of zoom out and we see the whole story and we can unpack the whole story now with history and hindsight and everything else, we can see God's faithfulness. We can see how God was keeping his word to Israel, even in the midst of those moments where he was bringing them through seasons of discipline in their life. And that's part of God's character and promises, that he is going to refine us. He is going to discipline us so that we can be shaped to be who we're supposed to be as his people. So I think that the reality is when you live out truth and when you follow through on your commitments, there will be times where people are going to sit there and say, hey, this doesn't feel like you're being very loving to me right now, or this doesn't feel like you're committed to my well-being in this moment. And that's where, you have to be really honest with yourself and God. Like, am I being truthful? Am I still following through on my commitments, even if people feel like I'm not? In some cases, it's going to be an issue just between you and God that you can, with integrity, say to yourself, no, I really think I am being truthful in this moment, even if it hurts the person and they're not feeling it.
That's such a difficult spot to navigate. And this, like, living out our commitments and living in full, unabashed, unbacked up honesty, just everything we say being fully honest, like that has to happen in the big context, right? And like that's where the passage starts, is the conversation on marriage and being people who commit to those vows, where I think you guys again helpfully unpacked why that was a conversation that needed to happen, and one that hits pretty close to home today, right? Like, I'm really thankful that I have parents who have stuck it out and are still married. And after what will be in a couple of weeks here, 15 years of my marriage, I've been able to, Laura has endured, like we all know.
I was going to say, who has been able to?
Laura has endured a decade and a half of low-key torture. But yeah, I've lots of marriages around me that I can look to, but I also have a lot of marriages I can look at and say, like, it's heartbreaking to watch. And so, Derek, I think you specifically sort of tapped into a real tension here, that there is some truth that needs to be called out in this passage, that we are far too frivolous in our commitments, specifically around marriage. But then also as the church, we haven't held up our end of the bargain and how we walk that out lovingly with people who have had marriages that have broken down for one reason or another. So I know that you even mentioned in your sermon on Sunday, you wanted to sort of flesh that out a little bit more. So I'll give you some space to do that.
Yeah, there's a real tension when you tackle this and it's the tension that Jesus embodied, going back to Jesus's embodiment, right? John 1, Jesus comes full of grace and truth, right? And you can't actually have grace unless you have truth, because there's no need for grace if there's not a truth we haven't measured up to.
Yeah.
But when you speak truth without grace, have you fully spoken the truth? I think you've left part of the truth out. So as we come to this, that's my heart was heavy thinking, okay, how do I speak and uphold the truth of what God is so clear on throughout all of his word, which is the sacredness of the marriage covenant and how he holds that in high esteem. Again, when Paul talks in Ephesians 5 and says, I'm talking about men and women, but actually I'm talking about Jesus and the church.
Yeah.
whoa. He's saying this is a picture of the gospel. That's what it's meant to be amongst my people, that your marriage would be evangelism. People would look in and they would see a picture of Jesus in the church. But that's a high standard to throw out there, right? But that's how that's the depth of this relationship, and we don't want to in any way diminish that. At the same time, the church has not always been a wonderful place full of grace to those who have failed in that area, right?
Yeah.
We tend to pick our areas where we're okay with people failing, and where we can extend grace and where we can't. And so I wanted people who were listening in to know we're not going to diminish what God says about marriage and divorce. We hold this very seriously, but we also believe in a God of grace, and you can be embraced here as you now seek anew and afresh what it means to follow Jesus faithfully where you are now. And within that, there's it's both simple and nuanced, right? And we love simple. I don't think we love nuance. That's been my experience, at least.
I don't think you're wrong.
Tend to love nuance. It's a lot easier if we just have simple ways to make decisions about things. And even when it comes to the issue of what is an acceptable reason for divorce, I thank God in His grace, not because He loves divorce, but because He's gracious towards people, makes allowance for divorce. And as I said on Sunday, there are good Bible believing Christians who differ on what those reasons entail, or even if there is a legitimate reason that would allow you to remarry. I think there is, but I'm also very cautious to say it's may not must.
Yeah.
And that God can do beautiful things in the midst of relationships that have been broken, and covenants that have been broken, when there's a repentant spirit amongst the one who has broken it, and there's a desire to reconcile with the other party who has been treated unfairly and unfaithfully, right?
Yeah.
And so that we should always ask that question, not because there's an allowance here, can I get a divorce, but what does God want me to do in this situation, even when He makes allowance?
Yeah, that distinction between may and must, oh man, like that was a light bulb moment for me. And as you sort of pointed us back towards like the gospel, right? If you think again, Old Testament, you think through the book of Hosea and all through the Old Testament, where God refers to Israel as an unfaithful bride, right? Like the divorce language and the marriage like analogy there is real strong through the covenant between God and His people. And so if we're supposed to preach the gospel with our marriage, there has to be room for grace and reconciliation, even after unfaithfulness, which again, I don't say that lightly or trivially, because I know that comes with a tremendous amount of sacrifice and complexity and counseling and investment and all those sorts of things. That's not just I academically agree with that this happens in scripture, so now I need to live it out. That is an embodied truth situation. And also the
reconciliation reconciliation cannot happen without the repentance of the one who needs to be reconciled.
Yeah.
Right. So let's hold that there too. It's not just about like the person who's been wronged repeatedly forgiving while the other person has made no effort to repent.
Mm-hmm. And there's so much complexity here, because I know, Derek, you laid out some, reasons for divorce that would be really trivial. My feelings are gone, or we fell out of love, or I fell in love with this other person while I was married to this other person. I think we all are like, that's just unbiblical and garbage reasons. Not to be too harsh, but like those just don't fall inside of the bounds of scripture. But there's, Kirk, I thought you helpfully pointed out that there's a tension here, because one person could be in that spot and the other person could not be, right? Like somebody's walking away from a marriage that another person is deeply trying to stay invested in. and that our sin and inability to keep our commitments wreaks havoc and creates chaos in the lives of others. So Kirk, I'd love for you to build that out for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's the passage in Matthew 5, Jesus uses some really strong words that I actually had to read several times over just to try to wrap my head around what he was getting at, because he says in verse 32, he says, I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. And there is this connecting point by these guys who are looking for the easy way out of their marriage relationships and their covenants in marriage. We're actually creating chaos in the life of their spouse, not just because they were divorcing their spouse, although that's chaos enough for anybody who's ever experienced that kind of pain, but actually that there is a level of responsibility that you bear in terms of the other person ending up making decisions that don't honor God either. And that connecting point is something that is, man, I don't think that most people like to think about that. Like, it's one thing to think about, I'm responsible for my own actions and my own sin, and they're responsible for their actions and their decisions. But Jesus here actually puts some level of responsibility on the man and says, man, you bail early on your marriage, you bail for the wrong reasons, you're setting up your spouse to sin. And that is a mind-blowing kind of reality and responsibility for us to consider. And that's just Jesus reinforcing, like, don't take this lightly. These are not decisions that you enter into lightly when it comes to walking away from your marriage relationship. Take your vows and your commitments seriously to your spouse. Yeah, I think that what we need to always remember is Jesus is very gracious and very kind to give us space to have divorce in some very dark, difficult moments and circumstances. But I'm afraid that too often we lose sight of the day-to-day commitment it takes in our marriage. And you know, one of my concerns is actually the number of marriages that are functionally divorced without ever getting a paper of divorce. They you know, there's Christians who are deathly afraid of going down the path of getting a divorce because they know it's not okay. Like, they know God says don't get a divorce, and so they go, okay, I'm just not going to get a divorce. But they're living every day in their marriage as if they're divorced. The only thing that's missing is the piece of paper, and so in those cases, like, we are just as guilty of breaking our vows in those cases as we are once we fill out a piece of paper saying that we want a divorce.
Yeah, it's the whole conversation on the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, right? Like, I technically am not divorced, but if you're living in the spirit of division and not actively pursuing your spouse and a deeper marriage, then you're not really owning up to your vows, right? If you ever read your vows, my wife is a saint and like literally printed out her vows. I have them right here. So like printed out her vows and then frame them for me. So I get reminded daily of the promises that we made 15 years ago. And that's a helpful practice for us to have those in front of us constantly, because those are not cheap words, man. Like, that's a real commitment, and we need to be reminded of that.
I have a few pastor friends who they keep a copy of all the wedding vows for every wedding ceremony they do. And when the couple inevitably shows up for marriage counseling, the first thing the pastor does is pull out copies of the wedding vows and gives it to each person and says, how you doing on this? And just brings everybody right back to ground zero, right? And reminds them where it all began.
And that's helpful. I know, like, even attending marriages or performing ceremonies and stuff, like, you get reminded of the commitment that you're making. And I think it's easy to see the
Tim Keller says,
you go, Derek.
I was going to say, Tim Keller says that our vows are a promise we make to our future self.
I like that.
Yeah.
Now, I think we can see the breakdown when the commitment is big, right? Like when it's a marriage, or even if you go like business contract, or Kirk, I think you touched on like even church membership, or like those promises that we make in dedicating our kids, or as congregations, when we stand up and promise to be praying for and investing in the spiritual lives of our young people as they get dedicated, and we make that commitment. But I thought you guys touched on some real helpful things in the little everyday stuff of life. Like, I think it was Derek said the I'll pray for yous. Oh man, like, I don't know if I'll get fired for saying this, but there have been way too many times where I've said that and then forgotten, and not because I, was lying in the moment, intentionally being like, I'm going to say this to get out of this situation, but I just didn't have the integrity and intentionality to keep that promise. And there's those little things every day. And one of you guys as well mentioned parenting, right? Like being consistent in what you say and then what you do as a parent, man. Like these are the hard things of being people whose word is their bond and like reflects the God whose word brings reality into existence. Derek, I'm going to hand that one to you because I think you hit on a couple of those.
Yeah, the parenting one got drilled into me by, I don't even remember who it was, but when we had young kids, because this, like young kids wear you down. They're experts. They figured it out on how to like just wear you down to get you to give up.
Browbeat you.
And I realized I had got to the point with my kids where my kids knew that the first no wasn't really no. It wasn't until we got to the fifth no that the no was really no, which is the exact opposite of what Jesus is saying here, right? Like, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And I think your kids know better than anybody whether that's actually true. Like if you're a person whose yes is yes and no is no. I thought of, I've always been someone who takes it seriously when I say I'm going to show up at a certain time, because I think, again, like it's in the little things. If you say you're going to show up somewhere and be somewhere at this time, then you should show up and be somewhere at that time. That's what it means to live up to your word, right? And it's really in those little areas that lay the groundwork for the big things. And I'm not saying like if you're a person who's late, you're going to cheat on your wife, but I'm just saying like integrity is built through little decisions as well as big ones.
Yeah, if you talk to anybody whose marriage has broken down, it's the culmination of 1,000 or more decisions before that. And circling back to the parenting thing, Derek, I remember coming to you, frustrated as a parent, probably 3 or 4 years ago, and some of the stuff that Laura and I were wrestling through it. And you said this line, and I've come back to it continually, that you're in the hard stage of staying consistent. And I was like, oh, that's so wise, but so frustrating all at the same time. Because I just want to be like, fine, have whatever you're asking me for 73 times in a day. But the hard work of staying consistent and meaning what you say is, man, like, and that's true.
It's part of the discipling. It's part of the discipling process of our kids, right?
And discipling for us too.
It just gives you a glimpse of what Jesus feels like when we ask him for the same thing 100 times over.
Parenting is.
He does say ask and keep asking, so.
You're not wrong. Knock and keep knocking and knock until the door is open. I guess like there's some language in there that you could justify that for sure if you really wanted to.
Maybe don't teach your kids that.
I never had to teach my kids. They knew it automatically.
Yeah. But it's again in the faithfulness and the little things that shape us, right? Like I think even if like we think through the discipleship process of us as human beings, right? We want it to be like, hey, I went to this conference or convention, or I had this like come to Jesus moments, and those can be significant turning points for us. but I don't know about you, but it's the drudgery of being formed in the everyday that has really led to the greatest transformation in my life. Not in the like big, fire moments. It's the everyday learning to be a disciple of Jesus in the difficult everyday stuff of life. So I'm going to throw this to you first, Kirk. And then I'll come to you, Derek. How do we become those people who keep their words and accurately reflect the King and the kingdom that we're called to be a part of?
Yeah, I don't know any other way than to, first of all, constantly put your gaze on the one who always keeps his promises. And second, to live in a space of inviting him to constantly chip away at the places in your life where you're not following through. And because we all have it, we've identified it. We all have those spaces and places that we're not fully following through or keeping, what we've said we were going to do. And I think a place of humble submission, of being honest when we failed, and allowing God to continue to shape us is important. And then, practically, I think that there are some practical things that we just need to build some disciplines into our life as God points things out to us where we need to, change. So the "I'll pray for you" example, right, which is classic Christianese. It's for me, I've had to learn the discipline of when I say that, I will literally just have to stop on the spot and, take 60 seconds and pray for somebody. Because I know myself enough to know that my day will get so busy that I'll forget what I said I was going to do. So as God shows you those places where you need to change, then figure out some good disciplines to put into your life to make sure that you actually are changing.
And Derek, I thought you landed on some really helpful, a conversation on confession, which for the second week in a row, you're calling us to repent and make amends. And I thought that was helpful for us. But yeah, so would you circle back to that for us?
Yeah, I don't think Amanda will. You should never say, "I don't think my wife's going to mind me sharing this." That's a bad lead. But I know that she won't, because she's shared this story many times herself. It was transformative for her. So she self-admittedly, when she was a teenager, had a bit of an issue with honesty, and got into habits. And this is what we do, right? We get into habits of lying, and you get away with the lie. Or you find that lies make life easier in the moment, and it becomes a habitual way of coping with things. And so she had got herself into this and felt convicted about it, and got to the point where the only way that she was able to break a habit of lying was by forcing herself to tell the truth, so that she would catch herself in a lie and would turn to the person and say, "I'm sorry, actually, that's not true. I don't know why I said that. This is the truth." Or she didn't know why she said it. Hopefully you don't lie about the excuse either. But I think replacing lies with truth, right? And that means going and confessing to the person that you have been dishonest with and telling them the truth and asking them for their forgiveness. You never just remove something. You have to remove one thing and replace it with another. So if you're going to remove dishonesty from the equation, you have to replace it with speaking truth.
I love that. And for me, one of the things that was most helpful this week as we sort of wrap up here was, Derek, that quote that you had from Josephus, this vision for me that felt like a call forward for us as the people of God to be something different in a world where people don't really trust anything you say. Would you just read that as sort of like our closing benediction here?
Yeah. I mean, this would be what it means for us to be salt and light in the area of truth, if this would be true for us. And again, I think this is incredibly important, as I said on Sunday, because we have a message to bring that's difficult for people to believe. So when they cannot believe us in other areas, it makes it easier for them to write off the truth of the gospel. When we speak the truth in all other areas, it gives credence to the fact that we actually, even if they think we're nuts, we absolutely believe the gospel to be true and real, right? So Josephus writes and says of the early Christians, they're eminent for fidelity and are ministers of peace. Whatever they say also is firmer than an oath. But swearing is avoided by them, and they esteem it worse than perjury, for they say that he who cannot be believed without swearing by God is already condemned.
And I love that. So, Rewind podcast friends, go and be people of truth in a world where things are gray and muddy. Be the clear and shining light in the name of Jesus, the embodied truth, and represent him well. We love you, friends, and we'll see you next week.